Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book that was important to James Ellroy, a book that thrilled him, moved him, inspired him. I have a great episode for you this week, but before I begin, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It helps to support the show and helps me to continue to make these videos. Okay, so our book for this week is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Okay, so this is a bit different because I've never done a 19th century text on this show before, and the story of how Ellroy came to read this book is actually very interesting and goes to the heart of any understanding of who James Ellroy is. But I'll go on to that a little bit later. First, I'm going to say a little bit about Alexandre Dumas and then a little bit about the Count of Monte Cristo. Okay, so Alexandre Dumas was born in France in 1802. His father was a general in the French Revolutionary Wars, and his father was actually mixed race. He was the son of a nobleman and an enslaved woman. So Alexandre Dumas had African ancestry, and that was something that caused him some prejudice and discrimination throughout his life. But he fought against that sort of racism strongly, and his political views were in the kind of liberal Republican range. However, in this age of revolution, he was often mixing with the monarchs, and he actually began work with Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, who became the King of France, and he worked with him first as a writer. Now, Alexandre Dumas was very, very innovative as a writer. He tried many things, and most of them all worked. He began as a playwright, and he had some success there. Then he switched to novels, which were more of the new growing form. And bear in mind, these decisions he was making were very innovative at the time. He even created a writer's studio where he had a scores of writers working with him, throwing ideas around, and publishing the works subsequently. So he essentially created a corporation. And he wrote adventure historical novels. These novels were serialized because, as you can imagine, this is 1,500 pages in this particular volume. So they were serialized monthly to huge success. You know, they often ended on cliffhangers. People were talking about them. And they made Dumas huge amounts of money. Of course, he was never really financially comfortable because he spent so extravagantly. He lived he lived a lavish life. He bought himself a mansion that is now a writer's home that became essentially his writer's studio where other writers would work. He had many mistresses. His marriage produced no children, but he had at least four illegitimate children, one of whom became a very successful writer himself. And he began to fall from favor when Louis Philippe, he had actually helped gain the French throne from Charles X in a coup. But then Louis Philippe fell in another coup orchestrated by Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte. I hope I'm getting all these names right. Apologies if any of the pronunciations are a bit off. And subsequently, Alexandre Dumas fell from favor, and there were changing literary tastes as well. The move was towards kind of more serious fiction, more kind of grounded literature. And essentially, Dumas went into exile, first into Belgium and then to Russia, where he produced travel books, and then finally to Italy, where he became a strong supporter of Italian unification. So he was always a political animal. And then eventually he moved back to France and he died in Normandy. And he leaves behind a legacy as one of the most successful writers of all time, even though he was out of favor at the time of his death. And trust me, that's a story that many a writer has fallen into. Okay, so the Count of Monte Cristo, he was actually threshed out the plot with a ghostwriter, and it came back to haunt him. Numerous relationships he had with ghostwriters. He was sued over, today we'd call it, intellectual property. But the Count of Monte Cristo is just a classic story. So our hero, Edmond Dantes, is a sailor, and his ship is coming into port in France. And the captain, Leclerc, is dying. He's been dying on the voyage. And Leclerc adores Dantes, and he gives him a task to deliver a parcel, and to one person a letter to another. Although the task is given in good faith, and Dantes performs the task, it's going to get him into a huge amount of trouble, because what he doesn't know is that the letter is going to a Bonapartist in Marseille. And the story actually begins with Napoleon Bonaparte leaving his exile on the island of Elba, where he had been made king, really just a toy kingdom after his initial defeat at the hands of the coalition. He's left Elba. Napoleon arrives in France, and thus begins the 100 Days, where Napoleon returns to power as Emperor of France and goes to war again with the Allied nations, and is finally defeated comprehensively at the Battle of Waterloo, and goes into exile for the final time on St. Helena, a much more dreary exile in which he was kept under very close surveillance and lock and key by the British. Okay, so the novel is really rooted in the history of what's going on. Of course, Dantes doesn't always see what's going on, because he is betrothed to Mercedes, a beautiful Catalan woman, and on the day of the wedding, shortly before the ceremony, he's arrested. He's not sure for the reasons why, but he thinks it's just a bureaucratic mishap that might be able to be overcome. And he explains all this to Villefort, who basically his arrest has been engineered by actually two seamen who were jealous of his fast rank for the rises of the Navy, and also one who's a cousin of Mercedes, who's also secretly in love with her. He explains the situation to Villefort about the letter. Villefort says he's going to help him, but ends up destroying the evidence, because the letter actually went to his father, who was a Bonapartist, and he's worried that it will incriminate him and his entire family on treason charges. So Dantes ends up being imprisoned on an island. He's there for many years. He grows bitter and angry at everything that's happened to him. He's lost the love of his life. He's lost his liberty. But he begins to devise a plan of escape. He begins to tunnel, and that's where he meets the abbot, or we would say the abbot, Faria, an old man who literally is also tunneling his way out of there, and manages to tunnel into Dantes' cell. It's a very funny scene. Anyway, they become close friends, and the abbot educates Dantes on science, literature, politics, history, the law. All of these subjects are going to stand him in good stead. The original plan is that they will all escape together, but the abbot is dying. He's not going to make it. And shortly before he dies, he tells Dantes about this treasure on another deserted island that he had discovered. In fact, he's been telling these stories to, the jailers for years, and they all think he's mad. They just think he's, they think he's just lost his mind. But he tells the story. Dantes, loves this old man, and he believes him. Then the abbot dies, and actually Dantes hides himself in the kind of burial sack, when two men throw the sack over the cliffs into the sea, and Dantes manages to get out of it. So he's escaped, he finds the treasure, and now he has these incredible resources at his disposal through all of this treasures, gold, silver, money, and he begins to plot his revenge. He reinvents himself as the Count of Monte Cristo, and he re-enters French society, which has obviously changed a lot. It's gone through numerous revolutions, numerous monarchs, numerous republics. he re-enters French society as this fabulous, wealthy, and very mysterious Count of Monte Cristo, who everybody really wants to be around. He's kind of, dark, good-looking, and mysterious. But what they don't realize, these people who are drawn to them, is that he's slowly planning his revenge. And not just his revenge, although it is a story, it's a classic revenge story, it's also about mercy, justice, what is right, how we are wronged in this life, and how we get over that. It's a really classic tale. Now, you might already be thinking this is very, very different from every other, well, certainly in appearance sake, this is very different from most of the books I've covered on this show that James Ellroy has been interested in. The story of how he came to read it is a story from his childhood. So James, or Lee, as he was still under his birth name then, was a voracious reader as a child. And it really kicked off after his mother's murder and he went to live with his father. His father was very lax, wasn't making him do his homework, wasn't even that bothered about him going to school. He was bunking off a lot. But James was, reading a lot. He described it to me as the only thing he was really precocious about. He was very, and in some ways to this day, he's quite insecure about things like maths and science. He really, really struggled with them. He's very good with his history and very good with politics. And this comes from being well read. The law, sociological ideas. He can really hold court on a lot of subjects. But some of the more practical school subjects he wasn't so good at. But he started reading, and it was an upward trajectory in his reading. Very quickly developed his reading from, the Hardy Boys and kind of kids crime fiction to the more established crime fiction for adults, everyone from Raymond Chandler to Dashiell Hammett to Mickey Spillane. And then a seminal book for him was James Jones's From Here to Eternity. I covered it in an episode on this show. And that was James's first epic novel. And he just loved the story, in the days leading up to World War II and the Schofield barracks on Hawaii and the Pearl Harbor attack. He just and life in the military and all of the numerous characters, interlocking characters, both his civilian and military life, the army wives and everything. He absolutely loved it. So the way he described it was his dad was watching his reading development quite closely. It's the only thing he really took an interest in about James's life. But his dad's tastes were for adventure and historical fiction. And he was kind of curious. He couldn't get around why his son wanted to read From Here to Eternity. And his dad was a vet, of the First World War. He's like, listen, if you want to read epic novels, you should read The Count of Monte Cristo. And he gave him his copy. And Ellroy read it, and he struggled with it. Maybe he got it to the wrong start because it felt like homework to him. But, the length of it, and obviously all the references to, French history that, we're talking about a boy who's like 11, 12, 13 here. It's still a teen. It was just hard work for him. But it stayed with him. I mean, that's what's important, I guess, because I remember speaking to him about it, and when I mentioned the title, he's like, "Oh gosh, The Count of Monte Cristo." He's like, "What a book that was! Part admiration, part it was a bit of a slog." But, huge swathes of the story stayed with him. And in many ways, the plot might be a forerunner to many classic noir stories. You could take any one of it. False imprisonment, revenge, assumed identities, the legal system being used for nefarious purposes, the political intrigue. There's a lot, actually, of grounding in the same way, the critics say Dickens wrote mystery stories. There's a lot in this, the Count of Monte Cristo, that really made its way into classic noir. And Ellroy talked of it quite fondly. I think he always recognized it as one of the great stories that just can't be touched. But it wasn't a book that he loved. And he spoke of it kind of fondly. It was almost like when some people say, "Oh, I did that marathon," or "It absolutely killed me," And then a few years after we'd had that conversation, because that was when I was writing his biography, I was re-watching some of his old interviews, and I watched one he did in France. Now, bear in mind, watching Ellroy interviews today is like he's frequently very grumpy, particularly when he's abroad. Maybe it's because traveling has become a strain at his age and he's kind of irritable. And as we're on a kind of classical theme, like I have a saying for this. If you'll be familiar with it if you've read Robert Graves' I, Claudius novels. Eventually, Tiberius has to move to Capri. To me, that's kind of what's happening with James and with a lot of older people, is essentially you reach a certain age as an older person and then you kind of just give in to your compulsions as the Emperor Tiberius did. But he was at this event in France, and there's a big audience. It was a Q&A on stage. There was a big audience turned up for him. And yeah, he was in a bit of a sour mood for all of it. But towards the end, the conversation veered towards French literature and the French literature he read. And then he's just like, oh, and then there was the Count of Monte Cristo. I read that as a boy. But a little smile came on his face, and it was exactly the same as when I'd talked to him. I mean, he truly recognized it as one of the great stories. And from my reading of it, for this show, I was just enchanted by it. Despite its epic length, 1,500 pages, it is remarkably fast-paced. There is always something happening. And other epic novels like the aforementioned From Here to Eternity, which I love, by the way, I think is a great novel, there was less happening than it felt like was happening here. Dumas was very much an action-oriented. His life was very action-oriented. He believed in progress and getting things done and living life to the full. And his literature is very action-oriented as well. And yeah, it's a classic story. It can't be bettered, The Count of Monte Cristo. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Remember to hit that subscribe button. Next week I'll be back on more hard-boiled territory, and I'll have a lot of stories about Ellroy and the making of LA Confidential. A lot of exclusive material for you there. Okay, see you all, everyone. Bye-bye.